And Sadie already gave the introductions to both Anthony and myself, but to give you a little context, Dante and Geo261 work very closely together, and we leverage Geo261's expertise in terms of helping to ensure that our overall go-to-market and product strategies fit the right markets and the right messaging. And I'll skip over my introduction. I think what we're going to do initially is kick off with our first poll question. So you can see on your screens that we'd like to start off with a little bit of an understanding of how your organization is implementing AI today. And if you wouldn't mind taking the next few seconds to sift through some of those options there, selecting only one, but it'll help give us a good starting point for the conversation.
And while we wait, I just want to say thank you, John, for the opportunity to chat with you today. Obviously, we appreciate the relationship we have with Dante and believe in the technology, believe what you're trying to do, and excited to chat about it today. So thank you.
Awesome. Looks like we got some results coming in. I appreciate everybody taking the time. And it looks like there's some reasonable understanding, or at least early experimentation with AI and others using it pretty actively across the organization. So that's good to see. So some of what, as we lead into sort of the introduction here, some of this may not be completely foreign, but I think at the end of the day, we all sort of realize that we're facing, a relentless surge of data, and this is across sensors, platforms, domains. The complexity of this information is effectively now outpacing human bandwidth. Analysts, operational operators are struggling to have the right tools and means by which they can sift through fragmented systems, siloed data, really just to get to the basics anymore, let alone extract meaningful insights. And at the same time, we're starting to see like the pressure to act quickly with fewer resources is intensifying. Decisions that I think once had the luxury of time and expertise, unlimited resources are now being required on demand with tools that may have not kept up with, and analysts and others are required to be doing more with less while the operational stakes effectively continue. And where we're starting to see this like even more is if you think about, how we tend to find and search for information today, our instincts are, they still default to traditional search methods, whether it's typing keywords into a Google-like search bar or clicking through nested file structures to locate the right folder or report. But this clearly doesn't scale in today's environment, particularly when it comes to enterprises or government institutions. These types of models were more or less built for static, predictable data sets, not really the vast, unstructured, constantly evolving information environments that we face today. And you're right, the image on the left, we're all familiar with it, right? Is a string of keywords we put into a search bar, hoping that the system actually understands our intent. Or right on the right hand side, right, we're seeing the manual slog through folders that might be effective when data is small, well organized, but painful, slow, unreliable, certainly at scale. These approaches are linear, they're brittle, and definitely disconnected from the way we need to be thinking about things moving forward. They're fundamentally mismatched for missions and scenarios that will require fast contextualization and cross-domain insight.
And John, while it's not really mentioned there on the slide, I think the other big way people are searching is basically by using Boolean logic, particularly in the unstructured data space. You find a lot of people are building these complex Boolean logic searches or these complex regex-based searches that are long, quite long in terms of their search string size. But again, the challenge is the same. How do I find the right set of flippers and flags to find what I need from effectively an overwhelming amount of information?
Yep.
And interestingly enough, and I know you, it's a perfect segue, It's brought up a lot of challenges, particularly for the folks doing the search, right? It's one thing to manage the data, organize the data behind the scenes. Being an administrator has never been more challenging or more difficult. Being a purchaser, right, within your organization who's actually creating the license agreements and paying for all this data, how do you understand sort of what's useful, what's being used? Do you have duplicates, right? How do you start to manage? If I'm a CIO, CTO, chief data officer, that's a challenge in and of itself. But I think what's really interesting is it's also a huge and massive challenge for the analyst, the person who's going to be using the content to make some decision or a decision aid, if it will, for your decision maker. I know I experienced this firsthand. I was overseas as part of a contingent in Afghanistan for a while, and I had a three-headed monster, right? I had my three 30-inch screens in front of me. I probably was looking at, I don't know, 10 to 15 different software applications at any given time. And my brain was the only piece of technology that could sort of coalesce all of those independent and individual systems into a set of decision-making thoughts or ideas. And so I think, the challenges you see here, I won't read them all, but as an analyst, all of this data deluge has created a large set of problems that we didn't have before, whether it's there's just too much data to make sense of, whether it's I've got to look across too many systems of record to make that clear, whether I, have different analysts that work for me with varying skill levels, and some that are on shift now are better than potentially some that are on shift later. How do you start to level up so that all analysts are effectively solving problems in the same way or through the same skill set? We have challenges with interoperability, whether we're using proprietary systems, open source systems, or systems that use APIs to talk machine to machine. There's always going to be some challenge with communication and interoperability. How do we work around those challenges? And then the thing that always gets us probably most often is, how am I able to share, whether it's a raw piece of content or a derived product? How do I share that without having to worry about things like restrictions on data, restrictions on copyright, data classification if I'm in a secure environment? So there's tons of challenges that I think all of this data deluge has presented. That wasn't necessarily as big of a challenge as it was previously.
Yep, good point. And I think that's where we wanted to really come in with a second poll question here. And we promise we'll get through a little more content before the next one. But we really wanted to understand ultimately, like, out of some of those challenges, where are you in your organizations maybe facing the biggest pain points, right? Is it in the data discovery and being slow and manual? Is it the ability to access that data is a challenge, given to Anthony's point, restrictions that might be on it? Is it the notion that, in its raw form, data might be valuable, but only usable and exploitable by a select few who might have the right level of expertise? Or is that sharing and collaboration and whether it's cross domain or cross division, cross organization sharing that is necessary, is impeded by some element? So having a good understanding of those pain points, certainly helps us understand how we want to address them. Good.
It's
Okay.
about what we expected, I think, right? Just sort of the old way of doing things just isn't working anymore.
Yep.
Very interesting.
I think it also highlights, right, that none of this, to include what we're going to talk about with AI and what we, folks on the call probably already understand as it relates to, AI. AI is only as good as the data that you have available and can access and retrieve. So I think that's, fundamentals 101 when we think about the application of AI.
Garbage in, garbage out, right? The old
Right.
adage. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because, again, kind of harping back on having been an analyst for such a long time, 80% of my job, and I think the poll agrees, was really finding data, the content, right? Having to go download it, go find it, make sure it's in the right format. Literally 85% of my day was spent massaging data or finding data, not actually doing any real analysis. And I think with the advent of AI, and AI is a very broad term, I think people would agree that it's potentially overused, or it's turned into a bit of a buzzword. But whether we're talking about machine learning, whether we're talking about computer vision, we're using the computer to assist our ability to make faster, better decisions, if we consider that to be what AI is for the purposes of this call, I really do think it's going to change the way analysts operate. It's going to give us the time back that we need to actually do the job we were hired to do, which is analysis, right? Analyze data, try and make a decision or inform a decision so that the right people can make the right choices. I think the other side effect of bringing in the computer to help aid the analyst, and I want to be very clear about that. I don't think AI will ever replace an analyst. I do think they can assist an analyst. It can assist analysts by bringing everybody up to a certain skill level, right? If we can kind of reduce the basics, reduce the data format challenges, reduce the data hunting to be an automated task, then it doesn't matter what the skill level of that analyst is. That part of it's sort of handled. And then all of the objective thinking, the critical analysis and critical thinking can be done by the analyst themselves in a much faster timeline, allowing us to make decisions in a much shorter time span. If you're talking about natural disasters, you're now making decisions ahead of disaster. If we're talking about defense, we're getting inside the enemy's decision cycle. We're moving things, to what some folks like to call left of boom. So I think the idea that AI can really change the game is important. We see this, right? We're beginning to see more and more organizations take on not just playing around with AI and kind of tinkering with it to see if it fits their need, but we're starting to see requirements come out where there are now requirements for government organizations to use AI to help automate or orchestrate some of their more mundane workflows. It's really interesting because the requirements for it go beyond just technical. They go on to things like it's got to be accessible and it's got to be able for anyone to use. It's got to be shareable across teams. We're trying to use the computer to assist people to make lives easier and to make it faster for decisions to happen in a shorter amount of time. I think this is the right approach. I think we'll start to see some really positive advantages to moving to this approach, and ultimately increased efficiencies, reduced resources, all the things that I know our government is really interested in trying to solve. So I think what's really brought us to is the question of, can AI unlock expert level analysis for everyone? I've talked about the benefits of it. I've talked about the challenges I had as an analyst myself. So the question now becomes, can AI be the ticket that unlocks that expert level analysis for everyone? And John, I know you've got quite a bit to say about this, so I'll turn the floor over.
Yeah, no, thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I think, right, this is the fundamental question that, we at Dante are looking to answer. And our answer is a very resounding yes. And we're building technology to make that possible. I think in the next few slides, we'll show a little bit of how we're enabling really any user, regardless of their background, enabling them to access, understand, and really act on complex data with a level of like precision and confidence that you may only be able to get from, say, an expert analyst with decades of experience. So let's dive into some of this. So maybe to start really at a high level, I'll give you a little background on Dante. Oh, sorry about that. I'm going too fast here. So, Dante is an AI-powered knowledge engine that has been purpose-built really for what we consider the modern data landscape, where information is multimodal in nature. It's fragmented, and it's mission critical. The platform that we've constructed fuses both unstructured and structured data. So as we think about text-based sources, imagery, sensor feeds, reports, geospatial data. It's about unifying them into a searchable environment, but it's even more than just search. So it's the notion that we can start with natural language input, where a user simply types a question just like they would in conversation. There's no advanced syntax. There's no specialized query language, no coding. You just ask, right? And behind the scenes is where the system gets to work. And the idea that once a user actually prompts the system, the knowledge engine behind the scenes will scan across all of the data sources that it is connected to across government, commercial, open sources, and it will effectively understand the context of the question, or it'll infer the intent of the question. And I'll talk about some of that a little bit later of how we go about that. And the idea is to rapidly surface the most relevant data and insights. So you're spending less time triaging and understanding what data may or may not be relevant to the ultimate question that you're trying to solve. And then as we're thinking about the surfacing and uncovering of that data, it's then delivering a very, very clear, shareable summarizations or analytical outputs that have linkages and a governance of underlying sources, visualizations that contributed to these outputs, and then outputs in the form of being able to act on them. So in the military, the notion of a course of action is something that's very real and distinct. But the idea here is that the outputs can effectively be what an organization needs from the data. So if you're solving a problem and you're using data to do so, what is the ultimate goal and the output that you're trying to reach? And the system could get to that point for you. And really, this is the power of what we think of as AI-driven analysis, where expert level, on demand, for anyone, and it's that enablement of the anyone that I think we're really keen on. Going a little bit deeper, though, Anthony mentioned earlier that AI is becoming a buzzword, and it certainly is. And I think one of the key things that we like to, draw a distinction to is, okay, well, let's go a level deeper and think about, all right, what elements of AI are we currently using, and building into the system. So, as we think about, turning multimodal data into like clear and actionable insight, it really starts with a user interface where the user actually has a very intuitive means by which they can kick off a workflow. And that query then is immediately translated and structured using large language models. Some are homegrown, some are third parties. We leverage a number of them. There isn't certainly one LLM to rule them all. We know that, and we leverage different ones at different times within the system, depending on the query. Um, Effectively, once that query is understood, we leverage tools like knowledge graphs, indexing and ranking, some generative AI capability to show insights and summarization of particularly text-based content. But it's really pulling all these things together, using them when they're needed. So it's not just using them all at one time, for the ability to really interpret and prioritize and extract the meaning from the data sets. And ultimately, what ends up happening is as we sift through this data and generate those insights, the insights and results that are coming back are all contextualized. They're aligned to the original question. They're sorted by source types, whether you can sift through imagery, like vendors of certain images. You can search through sourcing. And you can filter through a lot of the data sources as you typically would and intuitively understand. And then effectively, it's thinking about how do we take action on it, right? I mentioned that in the previous slide. So how can we leverage things like being able to share results or being able to monitor key indicators, connecting to third-party APIs, like so some of the traditional analytical tools that y'all may leverage today. This is where we can plug into those systems and either provide capability within that ecosystem or have very easy bidirectional communication between those systems where you can search, retrieve, and then export into those environments. So, with that, I think it's maybe more important to jump into some of the use cases, scenarios. What does this system look like? And there's a couple here. They may lean a little bit more on sort of the military intelligence side up front, given that's where our current foundation of customers are. But ultimately, as you think about some of the queries and questions that your organization may be wanting to answer, the user interface, the data, the summarization, everything you'll see in the next slides will effectively be the same. It's just the query is going to be different. So, let's take a look at this particular example where, we're either planning a mission or we're understanding a threat somewhere across the world, and we need to see, North Korea nuclear sites is a common search that can get input into the system. So, The results coming out of that is what you see here in sort of the broader sort of overview of bento boxes in the top right, which give you a just more of a visual aesthetic of the data sources that you'll have access to based on this search. But you'll see the generation and summarization of content in the bottom left is where you can really start to see the AI at work, where right off the bat, you're already given some sort of contextualization of your search. Within that search, in this particular case, there are locations of prominent nuclear sites within this geography, and if we wanted to drill in further to one individual, we can. So in this case, we are now like drilling into one of those individual sites that was listed on our summarization. When it comes to the sharing and dissemination, this is where we can effectively save this search and set up different monitoring services. So if this is a location and an area that we need to monitor over time, we don't need to come into the system every time to see what may or may not be new. So if imagery over this area is actually very important, we can start to set up a monitoring service where we save this search. We can set up a number of different parameters. Let's say we actually wanted to see vehicles that were located around this area, and then understand their pattern of life. So being able to a vehicle detection model that either is homegrown within your organization or leveraged from a third party. All of that can get embedded into the system. You can find the imagery that you're looking for, that is necessary to run those image detection models on. And you can very easily, through a wizard driven interface here, select what it is that you're trying to do, run that model in the background, and as that model's running, that saved search gets created. You're notified of that, and you can step away from your work and be alerted once that service is run. The intent with this sort of example is to give you a little bit of an understanding of sort of the layout, some of the things that you can do within the system. But let's jump into maybe a deeper, more thought out workflow with respect to maritime domain. So in this particular case, we have a user who's interested in shipping activity near the port of Lagos, right? So similar to the last visuals, right? You get your summarization of content. In this particular case, because the system knows it's a maritime query, it's actually going to uprank data sets that are most relevant to the maritime domain, like AIS ship tracking data. So we're starting to see here context around, news articles that are coming out around that particular port. We see our latest, imagery that is potentially available coming from government commercial sources. But we now also have access to, in this particular case, an AIS ship tracking feed where we can start to see a variety of vessel activity within this particular port. And it might be tough to see, but at the bottom of this summarization, the bottom left, you can actually see one of the notable events that it calls out is a very specific vessel. So if we even go a little bit deeper, not just understanding the broad activity at this port, but let's say I wanted to understand and get very granular of understanding like what is the activity of an actual vessel over time. In this particular case, we want to know this vessel, where has it been seen at any other ports in the area recently? That is a query that can get run. And if we want to understand, deeper meaning or understanding about the pattern of life, or if there's any satellite imagery over that area that's actually detected that vessel, that's where the system can really become powerful. Where, similar to the last scenario, we can save that search and kick off, an analytical scenario where we find all these images that are intersecting at the same place and time of where the vessel had been relative to the ports. And we can get these images. We can sort through their resolution. We can sort through cloud cover, pick the best image for our work, and then send that image to an analytic model. Once again, in this case, we want to use a vessel detection model. So we're not talking terrain vehicles. We're not talking vessels. So a different model might be coming from a different source. And we can now set up a saved search where anytime there's new vessel detections off of the imagery, we will be notified. So I can, kick off that service, go about my job, and then once the detections are finished, we'll actually get results if there are any of the actual vessel that we have an interest in. So in this case, some of the things you're seeing are images coming from a commercial vendor. You're seeing the actual output of the analytical model, the vessel detection model. But more importantly, it's great that I ran that model. I found a picture of the vessel, but there's an output here, right? There's something that needs to be delivered either to your organization to be shared or collaborated with, and others that you're coordinating efforts on. So the idea here now that I've seen the vessel, I know where it's traversed, I know the ports. I need to understand, like, lay out for me very easily give me a summary of this entire collection. And I want to understand the key events over time of what has been captured. And that's where I think the system gets really powerful when it comes to being able to create summarizations of a safe search or a collection. Anything that you're sort of looking at over the course of a workflow can all get summarized at the end and then delivered to the right parties.
John, before you move on, you've obviously shown some pretty powerful examples there. The content that's underpinning these searches, where is that coming from? And do all analysts of the Dante system have access to the content? Can they bring in their own? Could you talk a minute about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll speak to the government institutions first, given that's the world I tend to live in. But there are a number of repositories that we are connected to on the commercial side, on the government side. One of the more prominent government sources of particularly imagery is Global EGD, which is a service that NGA sponsors and runs, and it's all about collecting and disseminating commercial EO, SAR, and then disseminating that to others across the U.S. government, some allies as well. That is a system by default we have access to because of our existing contractual relationships with some government customers. So if you're an actual government employee or you're a contractor working on contracts supporting the government, you would have access to that source of data. But what we're doing, and it's very similar to some of the other data sources, we're connecting into those sources via whether it's an API or some type of data connection. And we have that as a source that then gets surfaced in our system. So we don't necessarily copy the data over. It's one example. Imagery is just one example. There are others to include, point-based data, like I was showing the AIS data. I'll go into another scenario here where we talk a little more about some NASA data sets. But then there's commercial vendors as well. So if you're a commercial company, you have a data set that's rather unique, you're selling it into enterprises and government institutions. We become effectively a single pane of glass where you can surface results, your data gets surfaced, but it's based off of relevant queries that an end user needs. So we're constantly looking, or not looking, but we're constantly working with both commercial government institutions on connecting the right data sources. We can talk if we want at some point about, what does that mean for different security levels, because some data might be more sensitive than others. But ultimately, we're all about connecting to the right data sources. We're also all about talking about the use of this application in the form of use cases. So it's one thing to look for data, find data, surface data, but it's the so what, like what is it I'm trying to answer, and that's what we're getting to. So it's the notion, yes, we are a means by which you can surface data and search very specifically for different data sets, but we want to get to the point where it's beyond that. Like you can prompt our system to actually ask the question you're trying to solve, and the data sets that become available to you are ones that are most relevant.
And just to be clear, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the Dante system is when you do execute those searches against those various different data sources, the provenance, the legacy of where you found that data and how the system generated its sort of auto reporting through the Gen AI aspects of it, it's that lineage is clearly depicted. And I think that's really important for those folks who need to make decisions based on AI, because you can clearly go back and see the decision making process in the final product.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And once we get towards the end here, I'll talk a little bit about sort of trustworthiness and confidence, because that's right, that's always the big question at the end of all this. AI is great, but how do I trust it? And we'll touch on that here towards the end. Maybe shifting gears, from a less maybe military or intelligence related workflows, I think about disaster response scenarios. Right, let's say I want to understand the impact of fires in Paraguay, as an example. Right, this is where I could start to triage through the system. It's also where the system, in the previous example, the system knew it was a maritime query based off of the certain keywords that we had asked. In this case, a little more straightforward, but the notion that the system will uprank fire event data coming from NASA to present back to the end user, is where the system tends to shine, right? Because it's all about like the relevancy of your query. So we know, and if you're searching for fires in Paraguay, you're probably not interested in maritime related queries. So we'll downrank things like AIS, and we'll only surface things that are going to be most relevant. You'll always get the news and the social media because they can provide, really a level of fidelity and context regardless of your query. Imagery is always important, and it's what we've gotten really good at just given our past performance experience as an organization. But it's some of these bespoke, unique data sources that, become more interesting to understanding sort of context around an event. And the fire event data becomes very relevant as well. So in this scenario, great. I've got an understanding of like the fires in Paraguay, what has been the impact and response thus far. I've got access to the data sets that might be most interesting. But let's say, as part of the response efforts, I'm actually tasked with monitoring very specific locations in this area. And I need to either understand if there's a fire event that has already occurred here, so I can plan coordination efforts, or I need to understand if there's a potential for impact in the very near future, so I can adjust accordingly. So, a couple of things we're trying to sort of highlight here is there's a number of ways in which you can upload or start to provide the system with those areas of interest or areas that you need to monitor. You can draw polygons around, a particular geography, and that could be a monitoring area. You can upload latitude and longitude coordinates via CSV, or just manually enter them, and that could be used as your areas. MGRS coordinates as well. So the idea here is like if I've got a bulk of AOIs, regardless of how those AOIs might be represented, I can actually upload them into the system and start to monitor some very interesting things. So, in this particular case, I'm uploading my images, or sorry, uploading my locations. And for these specific locations, I want to know, are there any fires near population centers, or are there any fires near agricultural areas? Because those are the things I really care about in terms of, being able to coordinate response efforts. From there, I can actually go through any of the image providers that I'm more curious about. Let's say, I want the highest commercial resolution. Maybe that points me to Maxar, and I only want the government data sources because they're the most authoritative. So I want the government providers, GEGD and CSPO. I want the sources coming from NASA. Which platforms, which sensors, right? This gets back to the filtering concepts I talked about earlier. I only want to see certain images at a certain resolution or percent cloud cover, or even as granular as like the camera angle or orientation of the sensor itself. You can start to get pretty granular, particularly when it comes to imagery of the system, and being able to only get certain images based on the filters and parameters you want. So in this scenario, I've set up all my parameters, I set up all the filters, I've saved that search, and here's a scenario where, okay, I can walk away from my desk if I want. I will be notified, and this is a shot of what a email notification would look like, where our system, has kicked off that service, it's running in the background, and now I'm going to be notified when that service has effectively, detected anything or has sensed any new activity in those locations that I had uploaded. And it turns out in this particular case, there was a new detection of a fire event. I got that alert. I can drill into it more to now start to see okay, here are those detections that the system just found for me. I can dig into them further. I can then effectively share any of those results with colleagues, with folks I'm actually coordinating efforts with, whether they span across, different organizations, or I've got to collaborate with others. Anybody who needs to make decisions on this data, you can effectively now bring them into these results, share them with them, and then also set up access controls. Maybe they're only allowed to view it, or maybe they then have the ability to run another service on top of it. So the notion of being able to disseminate and collaborate and really set up a level of permissions for what an individual user or group of users can do is something that's very, fairly intuitive. And it's all, particularly when it comes to, disaster response efforts, it's really all about the speed and accuracy by which you can get some of that done. Now, if we go through, maybe taking a step aside from the federal sort of landscape and look at something at more of a local government level, or maybe it's, the insurance real estate market. I want to understand things at a very granular local level. And maybe I want to understand how many houses in this area have pools. And by this area, in this case, I'm able to draw a bounding box around a specific location. I can do two things at this point. One, I can just say, give me all the data that you have tied to this particular geography, or I can then prompt the system semantically and say, how many houses in this area that I've just drawn have pools. And behind the scenes, the system will run through the analysis and the data it's connected to. You'll get the results back, and in this case, there's been 22 houses in this area that have been shown to have pools in their area. But there's one particular, address I'm most interested in, and it's this 8148 Hamlin Ave. So where I can start to get really some interesting results at a super granular level is, think about all of the, property information that a local government has on an individual piece of property, whether it's, private or a commercial or public piece of property, everything from building permits to risk analysis to appraisals to parcel data. But then you start to augment that with maybe some higher level, population trends or risk analysis with respect to, is this area prone to earthquakes or hurricanes or flooding? It's providing a level of contextualization that otherwise would take days and weeks. And my first job out of undergrad was working at a planning commission, and I was responsible for making the modifications to zoning boundaries, both within a paper-based system and as well as digital. And there were days where it could take me several weeks to get through a certain just small change of a boundary. And when we think about taking boundary information and data from various sources and fusing it all together like that, traditionally could take weeks, if not months, if you're doing it sort of solo and trying to just put it all together yourself. We're talking about a scenario where connecting to the right sources certainly helps, and being able to provide a level of detail that gives you a lineage of maybe what had happened at this particular location at a place in time. I think a really interesting use case here is, if I'm buying a home, I want to know, I would love to know. And sometimes you don't unless you do the inspection. And even at that point, it's hard to tell. But, getting a level of detail that is most relevant and very transparent in terms of understanding sort of key events that have happened at a location, I think is pretty interesting. And once again, it's all about the data, but the means by which you can sort of query, prompt the system, and then get the results presented to you in a way that's much more intuitive and quicker is where we're trying to drive. Um, so I think that wraps up our use cases, and I think this is where we wanted to kick off our third and final polling question. We'll have Sadie prompt us here in a second. So similar to the last ones, providing some insight around like how would you see, did any of these scenarios resonate, or help think differently about how AI might be valuable to you and your organization, right? And it's a slightly different way, I think, of thinking about the problem, right? Is the idea of leveraging AI for faster information retrieval? Is it accuracy of insights? Easier access, reducing manual effort? It's probably a combination of all, but if you had to choose one, please do so now. Yeah, very interesting.
Almost half are challenged with the manual labor of trying to find and analyze all that content.
Yep, makes sense. Cool. Well, I wanted to sort of, I'll wrap up the sort of the overall arching slides here and talk a little bit about how, how we handle trust and confidence. So, I mentioned earlier the notion of, the trustworthiness of AI. And, it's only as good as how accurate and the level of confidence that, the end user can glean from it. So there's a number of ways to address this, and we're addressing it in a number of ways on our side. It's critical, and I think one of the ways I wanted to talk through this was really thinking about how do we ground ourselves like in the pursuit of a question or a query. So for Dante, right there's a number of ways in which we could approach the concept of confidence and trust when it comes to AI. I think one of the things that I certainly can appreciate as you look at the AI technology landscape and it's growing rapidly is how do you think about like what is this company says they do the same thing as that company, but the devil's in the details, right? I think understanding where a company's positioned with respect to how they go about answering questions or how they go about the specific market or the way in which that they're approaching the application of AI. I think there's a level of detail then that is important, at least to me, than just talking about the buzzwords of efficiencies and speed. So, really where we fit is we're talking about providing context, global context. And what that means is, we're starting with space and time. So when we think about, where are we or where do we need to search? What time periods do we care about? Some of that information could be very subjective. If we ask a query about, I want to see things in this location that were recent. Well, what does recent means? Or what happens when if you search for something but you didn't bound that search by time, right? So going back to the Paraguay fire example, I didn't actually prompt the system to understand the timing aspect of it. So what the whole our overarching sort of theme here is like what we're doing is not trivial, and then there's the overall context or intent, like the inference of the intent of the question that is also something that isn't trivial as well. And we'll talk through some pretty interesting examples that we came across here. But ultimately, there isn't one answer. Context is very dependent on several factors and it's dynamic. So how do we effectively design a system that's able to understand this level of fluidity, especially when you look at this Venn diagram, there's 7 possible landing zones, right, in that visualization, and that's there's a whole assortment of questions that can incorporate space, time, and context. I think we've brought this sort of theme home a little bit already, but everything starts with the data. The trust starts with the source, right? If the foundation isn't strong, everything that's built upon it is compromised. That's why, for us, the step one is ensuring the integrity, the quality, and completeness of data, and whether that data is structured, unstructured. We're designing the system to operate across the entire spectrum. So it's pulling from valid and authoritative sources more so than anything else. I'd say what our system can get compared in some respects to the Chat GPTs and the perplexities and some of the consumerization of AI, if you will. On one hand, though, where I would say they tend to be more focused on accessing open web sources of content and providing context. We are definitely more focused on enterprise level, authoritative government institutions, and bringing that type of capability into these organizations to ensure downstream confidence. And that's why we focus a lot more on government authoritative sources, commercial authoritative sources, and not so much on just the swath of information that might be available in the open web. Um, and the foundation, though, is all relevance, right? This foundation that we're building upon, whether it's the types of data, the recency of the data, how much of it we're going to use. Everything that gets factored into that is all based on how we interpret relevance. We excel currently at working with structured formats like tables, databases, APIs, but we also navigate, say, the messier, more ambiguous, semi-structured data such as reports and logs and tagged sensor feeds. I think this layer of flexibility has allowed us to generate different types of insight from sources that many tools would probably discard or maybe oversimplify. And we're leveraging things like natural language processing techniques, some well-established ones to aid in the understanding of text. Right. And these examples here, like you're seeing some similarities with respect to, there's timing components, there's locations, there's names, there's quantities. These are the things that we key in on to determine the importance and relevance of a query, especially if we're providing global context, but it's all about space and time. Those are the key things that we're looking for and extracting. The next challenge is interpreting natural language, especially when it's vague and subjective, right? The whole notion of the natural language is ambiguous by default. This is actually a search from one of our users that had searched for Texas imagery. And of course, right, it makes sense to us that they wanted, EO imagery over Texas. But the query to most people, to the common person, gets interpreted as show me what Texas actually looks like. So if you think about bluebonnets, longhorns, ranchers, Formula One, right, that's like the imagery of Texas. And what was comical about this example is that the system ended up serving what we would consider relevant articles, but those articles, there was one article in particular, this one that talked about how large language models were being asked to show, what do people look like in each state? So it turns out this specific example, and you could probably get it from the background. It's not Texas. There's snow on the ground. There's effectively the inference had occurred where Texas was mentioned in the article, and this was the primary image of that article. So the point here is that even when we provide relevant results, or the system, the machine interprets it as relevant, provides back, there's still a layer of ambiguity that needs to get sort of sifted through, right? And in our case, depending on the user, like we really need to understand and are focused on the profiles and the intent of our individual customers. So, to many of our current customer base, like it's reasonable to assume that imagery from their perspective is something of the satellite or airborne variety. So we actually tune the system to reflect that based off the end user, right? And I think another great example of this, which is, it comes in the form of grammar, right? So how does a system need to interpret intent when grammar or spelling is incorrect? So this particular phrase is very different than this particular phrase, right? And the only change is a comma, right? So commas matter, but in order for a machine to understand and interpret inference, it's very important for us to really hone in on language and thinking through the ambiguity of it. The other point here is like sifting through and inferring intent. So in a more realistic example, like consider a user asking, are there large ships close to the port in Korea? Well, that's been a real search of ours, right? That has come into the system. But you have to infer quite a bit from here, right? Because, Customs and Border Protection may have a different interpretation of large, close, and ports relative to the Coast Guard or relative to the Navy. They all may have different interpretations of what does large mean, or close, or the port. What port? You didn't mention a port, so what port? And then even Korea, right? North versus south, right? I think this is where the challenge, I think, of traditional systems tend to falter. And we're moving beyond that, where we can now start to incorporate inference and allowing an end user to understand the system in a more granular detail and understand how they might be able to sift through that in a bit more. And I'll close out with this particular example, right? Here's another great one where two different users from two different organizations. They may be, intel analysts of a different variety, one at the Navy, one at the Defense Intelligence Agency. They're asking the same question, and this is very real. They may have the same question, but the expected results that a Navy intel analyst would want out of a search around ballistic missile threats in North Korea is very different at a tactical level when you compare it to, DIA, who thinks and operates more strategically. So how do we build in doctrine and very specific customer individual profiles where you log into the system recognizes you as the Navy intel analyst, and it knows how to modify its approach, modify its outputs, and that is something that we are working to incorporate now to return back precise results to our user base. Um, so doing a little time check here. I know we've got roughly about 10 minutes left. I think we wanted to, close it out with some final thoughts from Anthony, and then open up the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I'll just say, I think one of the interesting things you opened the webinar by saying that Dante effectively is a knowledge engine, and I really think there's a lot of power in those two words, and I know you use them intentionally. We're not just looking at a search and discovery system. It's not a portal into your organization's content. I mean, it is, but that's not where it stops. I think what makes Dante really, really effective is at how it can literally change the role of an analyst within an organization. What is supposed to be a very critically thinking and decision making or decision assisting role has become effectively a data steward role in many organizations. And I think Dante is an example of a system that flips that script back to where it should be. You're now flattening the job of the analyst for finding and hunting down and formatting content, and you're empowering them to be able to make decisions, or at least make more effective decisions. And that may mean faster, it may mean more accurate, it may mean with better provenance. Effective could mean different things in different organizations, but you're giving them that ability. And I think the last piece, we hear so much about AI, and it has become largely a buzzword, but there really are different types of AI. And I think one of the things that Dante has done that is really interesting to me is you've started to incorporate the many different facets of AI. You talked at the beginning about how you use generative AI to make reports that are effectively summaries of all the content that you have access to and can touch. You're working your way into agentic AI and being able to actually run agents that do analytics and provide derivative results back. And so I think that's really interesting. You're using large language models to do natural language processing and allowing anyone to ask a very natural language question to get a response. So I think when you said it was a knowledge engine, I think it's important that people realize that is true. This is more than just a content management system. This is an application that flattens the ability of an organization to do more with the content they already have and be more effective at it. So I really, really think this is going to be a game changer for a lot of organizations going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anthony.
I think we'd love to see some Q&A. And Sadie, I don't know if you're going to help us with that.
I think we have a few questions. So the first question is, what types of data can your system handle?
Yeah, I think our goal in general is multimodal. Like we don't necessarily want to care about the format. I think you probably saw a nice heavy hand of imagery, and that's, as I mentioned earlier, like some of our early work with NGA has accelerated that. We've gotten really good at connecting to various sources and sifting through those. But it's multimodal by default, meaning it's imagery, it's text-based content, it's point-based. We're now tapping into radio frequency data and looking at RF signals. So it's all encompassing, and I think that's important when it comes to providing like a level of context that's just beyond, hey, there's this image over this area, or hey, here's a report. It's really thinking about it through the lens of, how could AI tap into multiple data sources to provide a level of content that one could be available to the end user who wants it or needs it, or let it live in the system. And to Anthony's point, continue to feed the knowledge engine where, I've got a number of reports, and let's say I don't want to run computer vision on an image. I want to run, extraction from a text document, right? I think that's where we're focused on. The data sources that we have tied into the system today is everything from imagery. We've got some social news. There's video feeds as well. So it's all encompassing, and we're constantly looking for more and more as we grow. So really, it's unlimited, and it would really depend on what is the organization trying to, what do they have access to, what do they want to connect, and how do we want to set up the system to answer the right queries.
Thank you. And we have another question here. It's what types of agencies have already adopted this technology and what are they primarily using Dante for?
Yeah, good question. So I just mentioned, some of our early work with NGA originated out of a challenge called G-Search. And that's where it was heavily focused on sort of bringing together a number of unclassified image sources, the repositories that NGA has, and providing a sort of a new means by which you can access those data sources. But also, there was a little bit of forward thinking with respect to like, how do we knowing data is at an unclassified level, we want to keep it at an unclassified level because it makes some things a lot easier when it comes to sharing with, partners and allied nations. So how do we provide a sort of an ecosystem by which, those partner nations and others across the U.S. government could access and see what NGA has at an unclass level. So that was definitely more about surfacing, uncovering, and discovering data through a contextual semantic search process, but heavy on the imagery. And then the other one I'll sort of touch on is we're actively working with Space Force to help them ask or to help them answer questions or requests for information that are coming out of combatant commands. So, they'll get a variety of questions. They'll need to provide results and answers to their customers. And one of the first things they do is they'll come into Dante and to understand more of the landscape, to understand that context before they can even think about answering the question or running any sort of analysis. So it's for them, it's helping more to accelerate a workflow. And for them, it's also, it doesn't really necessarily matter what the data is per se. I think one of the other interesting things for them as we think about, cost savings and efficiencies is like they're not buying data. They don't want to buy data. They want to know what they have access to across the US government. So Dante provides them a means by which you can sort of see into other organizations. That way we're not buying the same thing that may have already been purchased from another organization.